Hi, I'm Dr. Gerald Deas. Welcome to Health Center from Downstate Medical Center. Today we have a special treat at our university here of a visitor that will give us some insight into things that affect us every day, and that is infectious diseases. It has a long history. It's recited in the Bible. In fact, back in Babylonia, when the Jewish people took the ark from to their side, they didn't realize that the rat was carrying the flea that gave them bubonic plague. And in the book of Daniel, they describe exactly what that disease was like. So disease has been with us. It's been used in Indian warfare, for example, giving Indians blankets with smallpox on it and things like this. But today we're going to try to go a little further than that, or if not further, to understand what happens when disease is discovered, how it's treated, how it's tested, to what treatment. So we have this wonderful Dr. Jim Jones here to kind of give us a history of that. So you're going to be blessed with a good historical ideas of why you should even take certain vaccines or what have you to prevent diseases. So I want to welcome you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Deas. I'm delighted to be with you.
Yes, you know, Dr. Jones, before we came on, we both have something in common, what university we attended.
Well, University of Michigan.
That's right, you know, and I was there too.
Well, actually, it was my son who was at Michigan. Yeah, he went to law school there.
I see.
But spoke very highly of it, and I know if you went there, you got a great education.
Oh, yeah, in public health.
In public health.
That's right, yes.
Absolutely.
But go ahead, continue.
Well, I was just, you know, the history of medicine that I have worked on really involves a miscarriage of justice in medicine and a moral catastrophe. That was the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment. And it does involve a very contagious infectious disease, which is syphilis, which, as you know, is caused by a specific microbe called a spirochete. And the spirochete gets in the bloodstream and becomes systemic, and it infects people and goes through 3 different stages. And if you're not treated with syphilis, it can be a fatal infection. And our government decided in the 1930s that it wanted to study what would happen if you left people, and specifically African Americans, black sharecroppers in Alabama, if you left them untreated. And that was that became the infamous Tuskegee Syphilis experiment.
Well, you know, when you speak of that, my practice itself has been with African Americans, and if I spoke to elderly African Americans who came from the South, if you had to discuss something about their genital organs, penis and things like this, you had to ask specific questions. You couldn't say, have you ever had syphilis or something like that. But if you ask them, have you had a haircut? A haircut.
Right.
The haircut, when you penetrate the vaginal area and the hair, which is coarse, cuts the penis and get an infection in that, they would say it was due to the haircut.
Well, and they would also say maybe that they had bad blood.
Bad blood, surely.
Because bad blood was kind of a catch-all.
Yes.
You know, you could have tuberculosis, you could have pellagra, you could have cancer, and for people who didn't have a specific notion of what causes disease, you know, who really don't know much about the germ theory of disease, they tend to say, well, my blood must be bad, and so I've got an infection and I've just got bad blood.
Yes.
And when the Public Health Service and the Tuskegee Study wanted to find out about syphilis in black folks, they told them that they wanted to talk about bad blood. And, they didn't say syphilis.
Right, of course. Right. Well, how did you get interested in the whole thing down there?
Well, it's an interesting story. I was a graduate student in the 1960s, late 1960s and early 1970s, and I was specializing in American foreign policy and diplomatic history. But I took one class that was on American social and intellectual history, and as part of that class, we looked at the history of the professions. And one of the professions that we examined was medicine. And I found the literature on the history of medicine just fascinating. I just thought it was really, really interesting material. So the professor from whom I taught that class said that I should abandon foreign policy and start working on American history of medicine, or the history of American medicine. And so I did. I wrote a doctoral dissertation on Alfred Kinsey, who was the sex researcher, and I looked at the whole area of sex research and the contributions that medical people made to it and the contributions that non-physicians made to it. And as part of that research, I became interested in the social hygiene movement. And that was the effort by reformers early in the 19th century to stamp out venereal disease and prostitution.
I see.
And so as part of that interest, I got a postdoctoral fellowship to Harvard University after I finished my PhD at Indiana. And at Harvard, I did some research, and I got into the National Archives, and I looked at Record Group 90, which was the records of the Division of Venereal Diseases of the United States Public Health Service.
Yes.
And in that record group, I found a bunch of documents on an untreated syphilis program in Macon County, Alabama. And that was the Tuskegee Study.
I see.
Well, when the story broke, when the news story broke in August of 1972, the Justice Department said that it would investigate. And this was Richard Nixon's, President Nixon's Justice Department.
I see.
And I really didn't trust them. I didn't think that they would do a good, honest investigation. I thought that they would probably do a whitewash.
I see.
But the Justice Department also told the National Archives, which is where I found those records on this untreated syphilis program, they told them to sequester those records, to not let anybody see them, and to give them to the Justice Department and just to surrender them.
Yes.
So I thought if that happened, nobody would ever see those records again.
Wow.
So the story I wanted to tell you was about a man named Albert Leisinger. And Al was the Deputy Archivist of the United States. He was a friend of mine.
Right.
And I called him and said, Al, can I come see those records? And he said, we can't find them. He said, when you saw them, they were at the National Record Center there at the archives, but they've since been moved out to Suitland, Maryland, to the Federal Record Center. He says, and we've had people looking and we can't find them. And he said, and even if we do find them, I can't show them to you because the Justice Department says we have to give those records to them. And so I said back to him, if that happens, we'll never know what happened in Tuskegee because the Justice Department won't let people see them. They'll deep six them. And he said, okay, let me think about it. And then he called me back and said, all right, you come here. I was in Boston then. He said, you come here and you conduct your own investigation and we'll let you back into the stacks.
Right.
And they don't usually do that for scholars. And he said, and when you find those records, if you find them, he said, we're going to let you copy them, and then after you get everything that you want, we'll tell the Justice Department that we found them, and we'll surrender them to the Justice Department, but only after you get to do what you want to with them.
Yeah.
And he gave me wonderful advice, Dr. Deas. He said, when you find them, have them stamped with the seal of the archives,
Okay.
and that way they'll be authenticated, and they'll also be admissible in a court of law. And that means if there's ever a lawsuit about this experiment for the harm that was done to those men, they can use your records to authenticate what actually happened.
Right.
And so sure enough, a couple of years later, a wonderful attorney named Fred Gray brought a lawsuit against the Public Health Service, and I guess he named a lot of people in the lawsuit. And he wanted to document what had happened. But when he filed motions of discovery with the Justice Department, he'd always get the same answer, unable to locate those documents. And so they were stonewalling him. They were just not surrendering the materials. So I got in touch with Fred Gray and told him I have thousands of documents about the origins of that experiment that will allow you to establish in a court of law what happened. And if you want them, they're yours. And so we talked on a Tuesday. The next day he was in my home. He came from Alabama to Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And I gave him those documents, and he took them home. He boxed them up and shipped them back to Alabama. And he sued the government, and he used those documents to prove what had happened.
Right.
And the result was that he got a big out-of-court settlement for the men, so that they got some compensation for the wrongs that were done to them and for those who died.
Well, you know, up to that point, what were the symptoms generally presented with the African American who had syphilis? Was it at a state of where the whole neurological system was gone, or was it at different stages of the disease?
Well, that's an interesting question. When the Public Health Service decided it wanted to study untreated syphilis,
Yes.
they wanted to find people who were at different stages of infection.
Okay.
So people who were in the stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, but they wanted to really load the study very heavily with tertiary, with stage 3 syphilis.
I see.
Which well, in stage 3 syphilis, it can have any number of bad consequences. If it attacks the neural system, you can have, TABIes, TABIes dorsalis. If it attacks the cardiovascular system, you can have lytic aneurysms that eventually explode and cause instant death.
When you say tabes dorsalis, so we can get a picture of that, what would the patient present with?
Well, a person with tabes dorsalis typically will walk with a very kind of slap gait, in their feet. It's neurological damage.
Okay, to the spinal cord.
To the spinal cord, and it goes all the way from the brain down. And its manifestations is just a very jittery, disjointed stumbling when the person walks.
Would it affect their memory or any kind of?
Yes. You can also have memory impairment. You can have speech impairment. It's just at that point, it's a very systemic disease,
Right. Okay.
and it has bad consequences in lots of parts of your body.
Was that a dominant feature when you finally found the people who maybe were not treated? Was that what percentage of the cases presented with something like that?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the exact percentage. I know that the advanced symptom, or not symptom, but the advanced consequence of the disease that they were most interested in was cardiovascular damage.
I see.
Was damage to the heart and to the major arteries, and in that area, I think a fairly high percentage of the men that they examined had damage.
Now, was that done by autopsies that they found the cardiac lesions?
It was done. It was done 2 ways. It was done first of all through clinical examination with X-rays.
Oh, I see.
They had a series of X-rays that they documented over time.
Oh, I see.
And then when the subject in the experiment died, they did perform autopsies.
I see.
And they tried to use those autopsy data to test how good their diagnosis had been,
Yes.
and whether they were accurate and what they thought was the consequence of the illness or the bad
I was at
effects.
medical school here at Downstate. We used to have patients come from the chronic disease hospitals from here for us to see different things. And that was one of the things that I was interested in when you were saying how they walk because of that spinal thing,
Right.
And they would let us listen to the heart of the patient who might have aortic difficulties and things like that, you know. But that was right in my time, right here in the 60s, that we were seeing that right here at the chronic disease hospitals.
Well, they also, with the men, performed spinal taps.
Yes.
And the spinal taps were very crude at that time. They used a large gauge needle, a 20 gauge needle,
Right.
which if you've seen, you're familiar with them, but
Yes.
they're big.
They're big.
They're big and they're painful.
And painful.
And they inserted those needles without local anesthesia. And
Right.
so the men very often had horrible headaches and just debilitating. After those lumbar punctures, they would just be, just sick.
Well, in my
sick with
practice,
pain.
I had a lot of elderly black men from the South, of course. And one of my patients one time told me about the spinal taps they would do on him. And I said, well, how would they do it? He said, well, they had a long bench, and they would set you up on the bench, until you put your hands behind your head like
Right.
this and bend forward. Then all of a sudden, the needle would go into the spinal thing, which would be terribly painful. And that's how they collected their fluid.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, part of the challenge that the doctors had when they were doing those spinal taps was deceiving the men.
Oh, yes.
You know, because they, if word got out that they were doing spinal taps, then the cooperation of those men would not have been forthcoming. They would have probably refused, you know, to undergo that procedure.
Right.
So the way they tricked them into it was they told them that it was a special treatment. They didn't say it was diagnostic.
I see.
Okay, so they lied to them.
Right.
And the other thing that they did was that they kept the men isolated so that one person couldn't walk out of the examination and tell the other person just what had happened.
That's right.
So that kind of deceit was just part and parcel of the, you know, of the moral catastrophe that was the Tuskegee Study.
Right. Now, when you think of syphilis, though, pre the experiment that they did at Tuskegee, syphilis was around, wasn't it? I mean,
it's, you know, there's no better documented disease in the history of medicine than syphilis. In fact, there's an old saw that if you know the history of syphilis, you know the history of medicine, because it is so beautifully documented. Early doctors, you know, did not know the germ theory of disease. They did not have the conceptual sophistication that we have with the rise of scientific medicine.
Sure.
But they could describe a disease's effects,
Yes.
its consequences, its symptoms, as well as any clinician can today. They wrote elegant descriptions of it. So we have from antiquity, from Egyptians, you know, forward,
yes.
ancient Egyptians, these beautiful, beautiful descriptions of syphilis at different stages.
Yes.
So we know a lot about its history.
I imagine
And we also, I was just going to say, we also know a lot about its treatment, because for a long, long time, there was the saying, one night with Venus and the rest of your life with Mercury. Because they treated, they treated syphilis with mercury until really well into the 20th century.
Well, that one night with Venus, it's terrible. They had to blame it on the woman, however.
Well, it is, but you know, that's what they said. One night with Venus, the rest of your life with Mercury.
I know in Proverbs in the Bible and so forth, it says to a young man, when you're walking down the street, there'll be people, women, who will invite you to lay on their soak beds. But beware, beware of that soak sheets, because the husband was away at the time. And this is in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, all about that syphilis.
Well, in World War I, there was a big concern in the military about keeping our soldiers fit to fight. And so as part of that, there was a big propaganda campaign to keep soldiers from going to bed with prostitutes.
Actually.
And so they would show this, beautiful young girl with this
Right.
enticing look,
Right, yeah.
come hither to the doughboy, and the caption would read, "Dirtier than a Hun's bullet." Stay away, stay away. So
Yeah,
they were concerned about that.
Well, when I was in the service also, going overseas, they had a packet for you of a soap, a brown, ugly soap, and things like that. If you were going to have any sexual relations, immediately go to the bathroom or toilet, wherever they were at, and scrub the area.
Well, in World War I and World War II, both, there was just a lot of concern in the medical corps, about syphilis, and the fear was, of course, that if you got a venereal disease, then you were going to be lost as a fighting man.
That's right, sure.
And they couldn't afford to lose manpower. So they paid careful attention to doing everything they could for the prophylaxis, of
Prevention.
Of venereal disease.
Yeah,
That's right. And then when some soldiers did, of course, get venereal disease, and they were treated and rendered cured and then sent back to fight.
Well, we'll get back to your Tuskegee work that you have done up to this point to bring it to the public exactly how things were done at that time and now with AIDS around and things like this. It seems like there's this dual thing going on even with all infectious diseases, AIDS particularly.
Well, I think the link between Tuskegee and HIV has to do with with community trust, because after Tuskegee, a lot of African Americans were suspicious and really very injured, hurt,
Right.
by what the government had done. And when HIV, this mysterious disease that we really didn't understand for a while, sprang up in 1981, and then in the early 80s, there was the fear among African Americans, at least some of them, that it was a man-made disease, that that it had been concocted in a laboratory by white folks who wanted to commit racial genocide against black folks.
Oh, yeah.
And part of the difficulty in that early part of the epidemic was to overcome those fears and suspicions.
And it's really funny how geographically how they did it with a triangle. How from Haiti to Africa to United States. You know what I mean? They actually traced it along those kind of lines to make that triangle of how it got to the United States.
Well, with every time, and you're interested in the history of medicine, I know, but every time a new disease, a mysterious disease comes along, the challenge is to locate the etiology. What caused this disease,
Right.
and then it's the epidemiological work of how did it spread, who got it, what is the corridor it went down,
Yes, right.
and how do we get everyone involved with it, for treatment.
Yes.
And with HIV, there was so much social dissent
Yes.
and controversy
Yes.
about its origins, whether it was a retrovirus that jumped species and had an animal origin, or again whether it was made in a laboratory. And in the early years, there was just a swirling controversy.
And I think hooking the gay concept along with it made it more it's not me type of thing.
Well, absolutely. There's often a tendency with diseases to blame the victim.
Right.
To find reasons that people have it that diminish them and somehow hold them accountability or hold them accountable for something that they have no or very little control over. And the animus toward gays in our society was very strong, and people like Farwell and people who were part of that right wing
Religious group.
chorus
Of course, that's right. So,
were very quick to say that it was God's judgment,
right. So,
that it was God's vengeance,
right. So,
okay, and that the people who had contracted the disease pretty much got what they deserved.
right.
Well, when you have that kind of mean-spirited
Yes, right.
nastiness
yes.
in public discourse, its only consequence can be more harm
Oh, yeah.
and a problem that has to be dealt with before you can get further down the road and start helping people.
Well, when you think of the troops, the African-American troops during World War II, which was separated into units, they didn't have integration of the troops at that particular time.
Right.
And troops landed at a certain area, like in France and different places like that. Was syphilis a part of the problem, or did you have any idea about that?
Well, there's a wonderful book by a wonderful historian named Alan Brandt, and it's called No Magic Bullet,
Okay.
and it's basically a history of efforts of our society to control venereal diseases in the 20th century and prophylaxis and treatment. And he looks extensively at World War I, but I'm not recalling off the top of my head whether he has a lot of separate discussion of African American soldiers. They were, as you know, in the First World War, they were segregated,
Right.
and they were commanded by white officers,
Right, sure.
and they were used more for, support, logistic stuff.
Oh, yeah, the ambulance corps and all those kind of
Right,
things.
exactly. And it's really not until World War II that you get more of a presence.
Right.
Although people have forgotten it, but in the Civil War, African American soldiers fought with distinction
Oh, yes.
for their freedom.
Right.
I have a good friend who's a military historian, Joe Gladhar, who wrote a book called Forged in Battle.
Wow.
And it's a history of black soldiers in the Civil War, and there's no getting around their valor. They fought like lions for freedom,
Yes.
and after the war, people forgot
Right.
the contribution.
Even to
And-
the point where they wouldn't bury them in the same cemetery.
That's correct.
But Dr. Jones, the time has gone by so fast, and you could sit here for another 10 hours too, but
But we're having a good time.
time is our enemy, and I'm going to see whether we can continue to really complete this, because I think it's very important that we complete your whole story.
Well,
So
maybe
if you-
maybe we'll have an opportunity again soon. I hope so.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. But so nice having you.
Okay,
on
it's a
the
pleasure.
program.
Thank you for your hospitality.
Oh, wonderful.
I've enjoyed gabbing.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
So you folks out there, I hope you
Okay.
have the
Oh,
history
I'm sorry.
of a disease known as syphilis and how it was not treated adequately by the medical profession, trying to find out how it progressed and what ways it progressed. And so these kind of things still lay with us, the history of medicine. And so we hope the next time you'll get more information concerning not only syphilis but other infectious diseases. We'll see you the next time.